Hello, honeys, and welcome back to the Beesness. We've got your handpicked headlines here from the arts news world, the best from March 9th through the 15th, and with no further ado, we'll get started on the buzz. A few notable follow-ups from the last week. We heard that the Brooklyn Museum will offer buyouts to workers amid its layoffs controversy. District Council 37, one of the unions representing the museum employees, announced in a March 10th statement that it reached a deal with the museum to offer these buyouts along with other alternatives, namely voluntary separation packages and retirement incentives, thereby beating the one-week extension deadline on said worker layoffs. The voluntary separation packages will also be made available to workers represented by UAW Local 2110, but it's unclear what options will be offered to the 6 non-unionized employees still facing layoffs. Henry Garrido, executive director of DC 37, said, quote, "The outcome of these negotiations is a testament to the power of union representation. When we fight together, we win. We will continue pushing for sustainable funding for the city's cultural institutions," end quote. Director of the Brooklyn Museum, Ann Pasternak, wrote in an email to staff the next day that the layoffs might still occur depending on how many workers accept these offers and pending a possible increase in city funding discussed at a special city hall oversight hearing. We also heard the National Endowment for the Arts has dropped its anti-trans grant requirements after receiving so much backlash for them. After the ACLU announced its lawsuit last week against the agency, the NEA has agreed to suspend the controversial requirement put forth by the Trump administration's Executive Order 14168, which requires grant applicants certify they would not, quote, promote gender ideology, end quote, yet this legal battle remains far from over. A March 18th hearing will determine whether or not the ACLU can get a preliminary injunction to block these restrictions from going into effect before the final grant application deadline of March 24th. NPR reports that the NEA, quote, agreed on March 8th to drop the certification requirement while the case is pending, but it has not committed to revising its grant selection criteria, end quote, and the NEA continues not to comment. Our sources note, however, that with that March 24th deadline coming up quickly, the outcomes of this case will be seen and felt very soon. We additionally saw protests in Mexico after a court-ordered closure of a quote-unquote Christianophobic show. A group of around 250 protesters flying rainbow flags gathered at the shuttered entrance of Mexico City's Academy of San Carlos, associated with the UNAM, and also the oldest art school on the American continent, on March 7th to protest the forced temporary suspension on judge orders of the exhibition La Venida del Señor by Fabian Chair. Our sources write, quote, "The judicial suspension of the coming of the Lord is unprecedented. Cardenas Gracia called it aberrant, and the UNAM has been wary of making public statements while the case is still before the court," end quote. The protest featured local queer community members speaking in defense of the show and celebrating the event as a closing ceremony rather than a protest, but it grew a little more serious when Chairez himself spoke out about the freedom of speech at stake here. As the show's planned closure date has passed, it's unlikely that it will be reopened, but it will be important to see what happens legally going forward here. A new report showing the realities of contemporary art transactions in 2024 caught our eye. This latest report on the global contemporary art market was released by the database ArtPrice and reveals that the market's worldwide total earnings in 2024 were $1.89 billion, coming from 132,000 successful transactions. The sell-through rate was 65%, while the contemporary art category rose to represent 17% of the market. Another point of note, many Eastern markets grew or at least purchased more or for more than Western ones. India was highlighted in this report for the strength of its art market due to demand for 20th century artist works in the nation, and Hong Kong saw a higher amount paid total than London in the contemporary art sector. Last week also saw artists and cultural workers protest the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil. Khalil is a Palestinian refugee raised in Syria, as well as a permanent legal resident who served as a negotiator between Columbia University Apartheid Divest, or CUAD, and the institution's administration administration. On Saturday, March 8th, he was detained by ICE in an arrest criticized as unlawful and discriminatory by many of our sources, while returning from an iftar dinner to his apartment with his wife, who is 8 months pregnant. He's now being held in a Louisiana detention center. Khalil notably told Al Jazeera back in May that he chose to work as lead negotiator, public-facing, between the university, protesters, and media out of fear of jeopardizing his immigration status. According to emails cited in our sources, Khalil asked Colombia's President Katrina Armstrong to protect him from persistent deportation threats in the days leading up to this arrest. On Monday afternoon, March 10th, approximately 3,000 demonstrators marched from Manhattan's federal courthouse to Union Square, calling for the release of Khalil. The protest was attended by the group Artists Against Apartheid, AAA, and others. It was followed up by an open letter published by dozens of artists and academics condemning the, quote, targeting of immigrant students, end quote, through the Manhattan cultural organization People's Forum. Although NYPD officers responded in the hundreds and walked with the protesters, only a handful of arrests were made. A spokesperson for the force claimed that a 21-year-old man was arrested for, quote, obstructing governmental administration, end quote, and another 33-year-old man was arrested for, quote unquote, assault. Tahia Islam, a visual artist and lead organizer for AAA, told Hyperallergic, quote, artists in particular have a very strong tie to the student movement. We have a legacy of standing on the right side of history and also of being silenced by institutions, particularly in this moment, for having pro-Palestine stances, end quote. The why we care on this story is best put by Northwestern University art history professor Rebecca Zorak, who signed the People's Forum open letter and wrote, quote, I'm especially concerned that universities may think that they can turn over a few students whose political expression they find annoying to the government in return for the restoration of federal funding, end quote. Last week also saw D.C. begin to remove its Black Lives Matter mural. Construction crews began dismantling the Black Lives Matter, or BLM, mural in Washington, D.C. on Monday under the orders of Mayor Muriel Bowser, who was also responsible for its installation. The 48-foot-long yellow mural was painted by the city in 2020 following the nationwide protests over the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. It was intended as a permanent good faith gesture, but was largely seen as performative at the time. Plans for its removal were made after Republican lawmakers threatened to withhold federal funding for the city. Transportation funding was apparently especially targeted, according to our sources, only last week, and the actual removal will take about 6 weeks. Mayor Bowser tweeted last week that the mural had inspired millions during a, quote, painful period, end quote, but warned about the potential costs of congressional intervention, referring to the, quote, devastating impacts of federal job cuts, unquote, as the city's top concern. The headline caught our attention, honeys, because the BLM mural will be replaced with a citywide mural project piece celebrating the 250th anniversary of the U.S. founding. This reminds us of the NEA grant focus shift, as well as several other projects we've seen changing the direction of things, especially under the Trump administration. All the same, board of the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, a civil rights nonprofit which advances the mission of the broader decentralized movement, stated, quote, whether they whitewash our murals or march in our protests, we will not stop until we fulfill our liberation agenda. DC will not be muted and we will not be erased. Black Lives Matter yesterday, today, tomorrow, and always, end quote. Last week also marked the beginning of the Centre Pompidou's permanent collection's closure for 5 years of renovations. The first phase of the closure that will last half a decade kicked off with a celebratory long weekend of festivities plus free entry to the collection, but undertones of worry remained in the French public. Workers of the museum have previously gone on strike against the project's implications for their job security, and global art leaders have expressed concerns about shutting down the entire thing versus pieces at a time. The Pompidou's president, Laurent Lebon, rejected that idea at a press conference recently regarding the plan, as extensive technical repairs, including asbestos removal, are needed. He reminded attendees that part of the plan is to have the Pompidou's collection in pieces travel and show elsewhere. Together costing a total of $485 million US. Architects Moreau Kusunoki and the Frida Escobedo studio are taking on the cultural project to redesign the interior. here. Two pieces of news from the San Francisco museum world last week. First, that SF MoMA has received $1.5 million from Google for its Ruth Asawa exhibition. The money more specifically came from Google's philanthropy offshoot, Google.org, to support the forthcoming retrospective of the late artist, activist, and educator who passed in 2013. Opening April 5th, it will be the first major posthumous retrospective of the artist with over 300 works from across her 6-decade career on show. It will travel after its San Francisco run ends in September to the MoMA, the Guggenheim Bilbao, and the Swiss Foundation Bayel. SF MoMA announced news of the donation earlier this month, as this is the largest one it has ever received from a corporation for a single exhibition. But it has now been revealed that funding will go towards several aims, providing free community admission to the show on April 13th, a 2-day symposium hosted by the organization Beyond Conflict and California College of the Arts, 4 other public events, UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute, and the cultivation of a community garden on the museum's 4th floor terrace. Now, we care about this, of course, because it's a long overdue recognition for the artist, but the timing is also important here. This headline breaks amid news of major San Francisco museums, including the De Young and the Legion of Honor, preparing for potential layoffs and budget reductions following a mandate from former Mayor London Breed for all city departments to cut their expenses by 15%. And speaking of, our second headline, San Francisco museum workers pushed back against proposals to slash staff last week. As we reported on at the time last month, the Asian Art Museum and the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, which oversees the De Young and the Legion of Honor museums, proposed staff cuts for the city's 2026 fiscal year budget in order to meet the required budget cut of $3.3 million. It is worth noting that the Fine Arts Museums wrote in their own proposals that the budget cuts would primarily affect building maintenance as well as security staffing, requiring the cuts of 23 out of 99 city-funded staff positions, and, quote, the layoffs would have a disproportionate effect on employees who identify as people of color due to the high concentration of POC amongst our security team, end quote. A spokesperson for the SEIU 1021 union, representing security guards, registrar workers, and admission attendants at the museums in question, wrote to Hyperallergic, quote, we believe that it would be ill-advised and detrimental to the museums, the workers, arts patrons, students, tourists, and the city itself to lay off workers and reduce operating hours based on a projection that not only has not happened yet, and where there are still multiple other options for city savings and revenue collection, and that historically has not happened, end quote. We are even seeing threats of layoffs starting to ripple across the pond as Tate Museums have cut its staff by 7%, citing post-pandemic deficit. The Financial Times reports that the Tate organization, which manages 4 museums across the UK, has cut back almost a tenth of its staff by cutting 40 roles via voluntary departures and a hiring freeze. This happens as it faces pressure to cut back from the national government and tackles its own deficit woes while aiming to continue fundraising plans for further expansions. Tate director and chair of the National Museum Directors Council, Maria Balshaw, added that the Tate had, quote, carefully streamlined our workforce through voluntary means, end quote, and, quote, bolstered new income streams, end quote, which appears to be true. But we should note the words of Sharon Brown, the National Secretary for Heritage for the Prospect Trade Union, quote, budget cuts and the impact of the pandemic have hit that sector hard, and more must be done to invest in these institutions and the workforce, which are an essential part of our domestic and international visitor economy, as well as of Britain's cultural landscape, end quote. The same could certainly be said for cultural institutions in the U.S. We heard last week about new Trump federal job cuts, which may threaten the futures of thousands of artworks. Expected cuts to the General Services Administration, or GSA, have reportedly hit the fine arts and preservation units, themselves primarily responsible for commissioning and maintaining 26,000 plus artworks displayed and stored across the nation's federal buildings, the hardest. GSA is an independent agency of the U.S. government established in 1949, which manages federal property, leases, and technology for other government agencies. It had about 12,000 staff members and a noteworthy collection dated from 1850 onwards. The newly appointed GSA acting administrator, Stephen Ahikian, outlined the dismantling of 5 regional divisions and the abrupt placement of 36 staffers on leave pending termination last week in an email which claimed they, quote, no longer align with the agency and White House goals, end quote. More specifically, the email pointed to Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency's overhaul initiatives to reduce government spending, or so they claim. The news comes only a week after GSA published, then rescinded, a list of, quote, non-core buildings, end quote, the agency intended to sell off or cut down operation costs from, and which would have left their artworks in limbo. Artists with ongoing GSA commissions have reported worries over being left in the dark when it comes to their open contracts. We additionally heard last week that Trump has pushed out the first Native chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. An NEH spokesperson confirmed that Chair Dr. Shelley C. Lowe, the first Native American as a Navajo Nation member and second woman to hold the agency's highest-ranking post, has stepped down from the role, quote, at the direction of President Trump, end quote, before the end of her 4-year term. Lowe was nominated to head the agency, the largest public funder of humanities, such as libraries, museums, scholars, etc., in the United States back in 2021 by then-President Joe Biden. She was previously appointed to serve on the NEH advisory board called the National Council on the Humanities by former President Obama in 2015. Michael McDonald has assumed the vacant position on top of typical agency lawyer duties until, quote, the president nominates and the Senate confirms a new NEH chairman, end quote. We care about this headline, honeys, because this is another agency or at least figurehead who has fallen in the wake of the Trump administration's rather undemocratic moves to seize control of federally funded arts and cultural institutions. This news parallels earlier headlines regarding Trump's takeover, for example, of the Kennedy Center, or the resignation of Maria Rosario Jackson, chair of the National Endowment of the Arts, from her position on January 17th as a response to President Trump's second term only a few days before his inauguration. Lowe emphasized helping small and lesser-known organizations, tribal communities, and educational institutions to thrive among her other duties as an NEH chair. Such organizations are more likely to financially suffer and become more isolated without this emphasis and resulting support from it. Last week additionally saw the announcement that Thailand's first contemporary art museum, DIB Bangkok, will open this December. That name, DIB, translates to raw or natural authentic state and is meant to reflect its mission, according to custodian of its collections, Parat Chang Osathanagra. Quote, we're building DIB Bangkok to be a true creative oasis, a bridge between Thailand, Southeast Asia, and the global art scene, where deep art circles and the simply curious can come together. Bangkok, with all its energy, creativity, and unstoppable spirit, has long been overdue for an anchor to its contemporary art scene that matches its vibrancy, end quote. Osathanagra inherited the collection from his father, late businessman Pech, a renowned collector and personality in Thailand whose art collecting helped propel Thai contemporary art to the international stage to prominence while trying to fill in the support holes left by the Thai government. DIB Bangkok will be housed in a 71,000 square foot warehouse from the 1980s, which has been converted into 11 gallery spaces, an outdoor sculpture garden, and more in downtown Bangkok. I now have a new addition to my bucket list of travel destinations. News of a new tartan pattern created to honor women accused of witchcraft in Scotland caught our attention last week. Created by Claire Mitchell and Zoe Veditosi, who founded the Witches of Scotland campaign in 2020, with the help of Claire Campbell, the operator of Prickly Thistle Tartan Workshop, it was officially registered with the Scottish Register of Tartans in February and will soon be incorporated into kilts and other garments. With the tartan pattern registered, the campaign has accomplished 2 of its 3 goals in honor of all those accused and convicted of witchcraft during the Scottish Witchcraft Act's 173-year reign between 1563 and 1736. The 3 goals were a pardon, an apology, and a national memorial. According to the University of Edinburgh's survey of Scottish witchcraft, an estimated 2,500 Scots were killed under the Act, 85% of them women. A formal apology was issued in 2022 by Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and the Church of Scotland. According to the Scottish Register, the material is created by weaving at least two alternated colored stripes together, and in Scotland, specific ones traditionally are associated with specific clans and families. But here, not quite the case. The new tartan pattern in question is black, gray, red, and pink. The black and gray colors represent, quote, the dark times of this period and ashes of those burned, end quotes. The red represents the victims' blood, while the pink symbolizes, quote, the legal tapes used to bind papers both during that time and now, end quote. The large black squares are made up of 173 threads, the number of years the law was in effect, while the thinner lines have either 15 or 17 threads. Both represent the sum of the digits in the year the act was implemented, 1563, and the sum of the digits of the year it was repealed, 1736, while the red and pink stripes are repeated 3 times, which of course symbolizes the 3 goals of the Witches of Scotland campaign. Mitchell and Venditosi hope to begin making kilts from the tartan as early as May in a, quote, living memorial, end quote, format, which donates some of the proceeds to charity. Last week also saw the discovery of a politically repurposed copy of a famous Shakespearean love sonnet inside of a 17th century poetry collection. The rare handwritten copy from that century of Sonnet 116, often used in weddings because of the word marriage in it, was found in Oxford's Bodleian Library and belongs to a royalist population of the day. Elias Ashmole had edited the sonnet to a song format matching music by Baroque composer Henry Lawes. Ashmole's version features several additional lines as well, which researchers believe may have been an attempt to insert British royalist ideas into the Romantic Ode during the height of the English Civil War, 1642 to 51. Shakespearean scholar at Oxford, Emma Smith, says that this confirms that Sonnet 116 may have been engaged with by readers in unexpected ways. And last but not least, honeys, we heard that the Getty has acquired the Ray Pettibon Archive. The LA-based institution has acquired the archive of the self-taught artist, most of which will be housed in the Getty Research Institute. The archive includes things like drawings, notes, concert flyers, prints, designs, skateboards, a surfboard, but the most valuable may be videos and materials demonstrating his creative process. Pettibon is known for his stylized ink drawings combining text and narratives, often referencing pop and consumer culture as well as history. Hyperallergic writes, quote, his career spans flyers and album art of the early Southern California punk scene, videos, artist books, drawings, and paintings, end quote. Those are our headlines for the week, honeys. We hope you're enjoying the return to warmer weather that we're experiencing over the last couple of weeks here. Hopefully I didn't just jinx it. We'll talk to you soon, and until then, take care, stay warm, hydrate or dehydrate, all that good stuff. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.